All right, so you're here to get smart fast right. On today's deep dive, we're tackling something we all deal with, time.
It's so fundamental and yet also kind of frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, and I feel like that tension's been getting worse lately.
Definitely. Like, think back to those early pandemic lockdowns.
Oh, yeah.
That weird feeling where time just kind of like stretched out and disappeared all at once.
Yeah, like for some people it was a total blur, right?
Right.
But then for others it was this like strange void of unstructured time.
Yeah.
And I think that really highlighted this modern thing of like feeling rushed all the time, feeling like you have to optimize every minute.
And striving for that so-called work-life balance.
Exactly. That's like a pretty recent anxiety, not some universal human condition.
It is. Like if you look at the lives of, say, medieval peasants in early England, I mean, their lives were undeniably rough.
Oh, for sure.
Servitude, disease, sanitation that we can barely fathom. But what's interesting is our sources suggest that they probably didn't experience the same kinds of time anxieties that we do.
So wait, are you saying that even though their lives were objectively much harder,
they weren't necessarily burdened by this feeling of time scarcity, this pressure to make every minute count, this guilt of not achieving the perfect equilibrium?
That's almost a paradox, right?
It is. It suggests that this feeling of being overloaded, of having too much to do, of needing to achieve perfect work-life balance, it's not inherent to the human condition. It's a product of our specific cultural moment.
Okay, so if we're all carrying around this anxiety about time, where does it come from?
Well, a key insight from our sources is that our modern perception of time as a separate, measurable entity is precisely that, just a perception.
A perception.
Yeah, like calendars, clocks, timelines, even that famous analogy by Edward Hall, where he compares time to a conveyor belt. These are all deeply ingrained ways of thinking about time.
So ingrained that we don't even recognize them as a particular perspective.
Exactly, like the fish that's completely unaware of the water it's swimming in.
So if this kind of linear, measurable time is just one way of looking at it, are there other ways that we can experience time?
Absolutely. There's this fascinating concept of deep time.
Deep time.
Yeah. And it refers to those moments when that internal clock, that constant ticking in your head, just kind of fades away.
I think I know what you mean.
And the self feels connected to something much larger. There's this sense of timelessness, of inherent sufficiency. It's like the boundary between yourself and everything else just dissolves.
Okay, so like when you're standing in awe of a truly magnificent landscape.
Exactly. Or think about the experience of deep prayer or profound meditation, or those early days of a baby's life where they seem to exist in this fluid realm of time. Carl Jung even described a similar feeling during his time in Kenya.
What was he doing in Kenya?
Oh, he was observing these vast herds of animals, and he had this powerful sense of being connected to some kind of eternal beginning.
Wow. That sounds incredible. But you know, eventually we all have to come back down to earth, right? Back to our daily lives with their endless demands.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you said, the anxiety of never being on top of everything inevitably comes flooding back.
And that brings us to this feeling of always needing to optimize our time. Like if we could just get perfectly organized, we'd finally be in control.
Right. But here's a crucial insight from our sources. The pursuit of perfect control over time is ultimately futile.
You're saying it's impossible.
There will always be more things to do than time available.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that. I remember this one morning I was sitting on a park bench, just totally overwhelmed by my to-do list. And suddenly it hit me, like this isn't sustainable, this idea that I'll ever reach this mythical point of being on top of everything.
And what happened then?
It was strange, but realizing that brought this weird sense of calm. It was like accepting the impossibility of something I'd been striving for actually freed me up a bit.
That's a really powerful anecdote because it highlights how accepting limitations can be a pathway to greater freedom. And actually, the modern world, and especially the internet, makes this feeling of never being enough even worse.
Oh, for sure. Like the internet promises us convenience and efficiency, right? But then it also bombards us with this endless stream of possibilities, making us feel like we're always missing out on something.
It is. Every Facebook event you can't attend, every intriguing dating profile you swipe past, every unread email in your inbox. It's like this constant reminder of everything you're not doing.
It's like technology promised to save us time, but instead it just gave us FOMO.
Exactly. And it's this vicious cycle because those tools that are supposed to help us manage everything actually end up expanding the definition of everything to this unmanageable degree.
So then we try to cram in even more, trying to wring every last drop of value out of our time.
Which can make us lose sight of what really matters. And there's this often overlooked aspect of convenience that plays into this.
Convenience.
Yeah, like it's supposed to save us time, right?
Yeah.
But what our sources suggest is that convenience can actually lead to a devaluation of activities. Well, think about it. We tend to choose the path of least resistance, the most convenient option, even if it's not the most fulfilling one.
So like ordering takeout instead of cooking a meal with friends.
Exactly. Or staying home to binge watch a show instead of making the effort to go out and meet people.
Or, choosing instant coffee over the ritual of brewing a proper pot.
And on the flip side, those less convenient but often more valuable activities like waiting in line to vote or engaging in a thoughtful conversation can start to feel incredibly irritating.
It's almost like we're losing our tolerance for any kind of friction or delay.
Right, which is why it's so important to think critically about our priorities.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we push back against this urge to always take the most convenient option?
Well, our sources talk about this idea of resisting middling priority.
Resisting middling priorities.
It's about identifying those few things that are truly important to you, your absolute top priorities, and then focusing your time and energy on those.
So instead of spreading ourselves thin across a bunch of less significant things.
Exactly. It's about saying no to the good so you can say yes to the great.
That makes sense. But then there's this whole challenge of procrastination.
Ah, yes, the ever-present struggle with procrastination.
We often just think of it as laziness, but the sources we're looking at suggest that there's something deeper going on there.
Absolutely. One really interesting idea is that procrastination can be a way of protecting ourselves from the limitations of reality.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Like we often have these perfect ideals in our minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is our actual efforts are always going to fall short of those ideals.
Yeah, nothing's ever going to be as good as it is in our imagination.
Right. And that gap between our ideal and the reality can be so uncomfortable that we avoid starting altogether. There's this great fable by Costa Gabradatan about an architect who burns his plans for a mosque.
Why did he burn them?
Because he realized that the mosque he had designed in his mind, this perfect, flawless structure, could never be replicated in the real world. Any physical manifestation of his vision would inevitably have flaws.
So he chose to preserve the perfection of the idea by destroying it.
Exactly. And this relates to a really important point about creativity. Perfection is often the enemy of done.
Because if we're always striving for this unattainable ideal, we'll never actually finish anything.
Right. And the key is to embrace imperfection, to understand that it's not only unavoidable, but it's actually part of the creative process.
It's about making peace with the fact that our work is never going to be perfect.
And this fear of confronting our limitations, it shows up in our relationships too, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's like that saying, relationships are messy and people are flawed.
Precisely. And one particularly fascinating case study is the relationship between Franz Kafka and Felice Bauer.
Oh yeah, the one that was mostly conducted through letters.
That's the one. And it seems like Kafka's constant indecisiveness, his inability to fully commit to the relationship, stemmed from this desire to live multiple incompatible lives at once.
What do you mean by incompatible?
Well, he wanted the respectability of a career, the stability of marriage and family life, and the freedom to devote himself fully to writing.
And those things weren't really compatible with each other.
Exactly. And by conducting the relationship primarily through letters, he could avoid having to confront the limitations and compromises of a real-world relationship.
So it was a way of keeping all his options open, even if it ultimately prevented him from experiencing true intimacy.
And this ties into a broader pattern that many of us can relate to. This reluctance to fully commit, whether it's in a romantic relationship or any other area of life.
It's like this fear of closing off possibilities, even if those possibilities aren't really serving us.
Right. And it brings us to this concept of settling, which, often has a negative connotation.
Yeah, settling always sounds like you're somehow compromising your dreams.
But our sources argue that a certain kind of settling is not only unavoidable, but actually necessary for making progress.
What kind of settling?
Well, philosopher Robert Gooden talks about how even the act of perpetually refusing to settle is itself a form of settling.
Wait, what? How can that be?
Because you're dedicating your time and energy to this endless pursuit of the perfect option, which may not even exist.
So you're settling for the endless search instead of actually choosing something.
Exactly. And here's another key point. Truly striving for anything meaningful in life requires settling on a specific path or goal.
So like you can't be a world-class musician and a neurosurgeon at the same time.
Right. You have to choose a direction and commit to it. Otherwise, you'll just be spreading yourself too thin.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about social media. I mean, it's impossible to talk about time management without addressing this, right?
It is. It's like this constant battle for our attention.
And social media platforms are designed to win that battle, aren't they?
Absolutely. Their primary goal isn't to enhance our well-being, but to capture and monetize our attention. They use something called persuasive design, which is basically the art of engineering digital interfaces to keep us hooked.
So it's like they're manipulating us on a subconscious level.
Right. Think about the endless scroll, the constant notifications, the pull to refresh mechanism that triggers a little dopamine hit every time you use it.
It's like we're lab rats pressing a lever for a pellet of food.
It is. And as Roger McNamee puts it, we're the fuel for the Silicon Valley machine.
Our attention is the resource being extracted.
And this constant bombardment of information and stimulation doesn't just impact our individual productivity.
It also has a huge impact on society as a whole, especially in the political sphere.
Right. Social media can create these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs, leading to increased polarization and hostility towards opposing viewpoints.
It's like everyone's retreating into their own little tribes, and those tribes are constantly at war with each other.
And it's not just about echo chambers. Social media can also be used to spread disinformation and propaganda very effectively.
Because it's so easy to go viral. And by the time the truth catches up, the damage is already done.
And even when we try to condemn harmful content, we can end up amplifying it by giving it more attention. It's a really complex problem.
So what do we do? How do we escape this cycle of distraction and outrage?
Well, one really important approach is to cultivate our capacity for paying attention to the present moment.
To just be here now, as they say.
Exactly. But it's not as easy as it sounds. Our natural instinct is to avoid discomfort.
Yeah, we'd rather distract ourselves than actually deal with uncomfortable feelings or situations.
And our sources highlight how this avoidance of discomfort plays right into the hands of those who are vying for our attention.
Because the more we try to escape the present moment, the more susceptible we are to distraction.
Right. And a key insight from Zen Buddhism is that a lot of our suffering actually stems from this resistance to the way things are.
So instead of trying to control everything, we should just accept it.
It's not about passively accepting injustice or hardship, but rather about recognizing that there are certain aspects of reality that are beyond our control.
It's about surrendering to those things that we can't change.
And paradoxically, when we do that, those very constraints often start to feel less restrictive.
Okay, but that's easier said than done, right? Like, I think our whole culture is built around this idea that we need to constantly strive for something better, to plan for the future, to optimize our lives.
Absolutely. And this constant future orientation can be a major source of anxiety.
Because we're always worried about what might happen instead of just focusing on what's happening right now.
And no matter how much we plan, the future is always going to be uncertain. As Pascal famously said, we wander in times which are not ours.
We're trying to secure our present by controlling the future, which is just impossible.
Right. So the key is to learn to be more present, to embrace the uncertainty of life.
But how do you actually do that? I mean, it's easy to say be present, but it's a lot harder to actually put it into practice.
It is. And philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti offers a really helpful perspective on this. He talks about the importance of not minding what happens.
Not minding what happens.
Yeah. It's not about apathy or resignation, but rather about releasing the demand that the future must conform to our expectations.
So instead of trying to control the future, we should just let go and see what happens.
It's about trusting the process, about being open to whatever unfolds, even if it's not what we had planned.
That sounds incredibly freeing, but also a little scary.
It can be both. But ultimately, it's about finding a sense of peace and acceptance in the face of uncertainty.
And this pressure to always be striving, to always be achieving, it's something that's instilled in us from a very young age, isn't it?
It is. We're constantly told that we need to be preparing for the next stage of life, whether it's getting into a good college, landing a high-paying job, or achieving some arbitrary measure of success.
It's like we're always on this treadmill, and we never get to just enjoy the ride.
And it makes me think of that parable about the businessman and the fisherman.
Oh, the one where the businessman is explaining his elaborate plan for retiring early and enjoying life, and the fisherman is like, but I'm already doing that.
Exactly. The businessman is so focused on accumulating more time and resources in the future, he completely misses the fact that the fisherman is already living the life he dreams of.
It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the most important.
And that we don't need to wait for some future moment to start enjoying life.
But there's this pervasive feeling that if we're not constantly producing, achieving, or striving for something, then we're wasting our time.
Right. And this mentality can be especially strong in certain professions, like corporate law, with its emphasis on billable hours.
Where every minute of your day is literally assigned a monetary value.
And that way of thinking can bleed into other areas of our lives, making it hard to fully appreciate those things that can't be easily quantified or monetized.
Like spending time with loved ones or just relaxing and enjoying a beautiful day.
And it can even make our leisure time feel like work, like we're constantly trying to optimize our fun.
I remember this one time I was trying to see the Northern Lights, and I was so focused on getting the perfect photo that I totally missed the actual experience.
It's like you were trying to extract value from the experience instead of just letting yourself be present and enjoy it.
Yeah, it was kind of sad, actually.
And this gets to this idea that our sources critique, which is the tendency to justify leisure solely based on its instrumental value.
So like exercising so you can be more productive at work.
Exactly. Or taking a vacation so you can come back refreshed and ready to tackle your to-do list.
But that makes leisure feel like just another obligation.
Right. And it's a far cry from the way the ancient Greeks viewed leisure.
How did they view it?
They saw leisure as the highest virtue, the very purpose of life. Work was just a necessary means to an end.
So it was like the opposite of how we view it today.
Exactly. And even the labor movement, in its fight for shorter working hours, often framed leisure in terms of its usefulness for self-improvement and civic engagement.
Rather than just for pure enjoyment and relaxation.
There's this really poignant account of textile workers who longed for enough free time to simply look around to see what is going on. They just wanted to be able to enjoy their lives without feeling like they had to be constantly productive.
So maybe the key is to embrace what we might call wasteful leisure.
Wasteful in the sense that it's not geared towards any specific outcome or goal.
Like just doing something purely for the pleasure of it.
Exactly. Simone de Beauvoir talks about the importance of individual joy, and I think that's so relevant here.
We need to give ourselves permission to just enjoy life without feeling guilty about it.
And this pressure to be constantly productive, it's not just a modern phenomenon. It has historical and religious roots as well.
Really? Like what?
Well, think about the Protestant work ethic.
Ah, the idea that hard work is a sign of virtue.
Exactly. And within the Calvinist tradition, there was this intense anxiety around idleness.
Because it could be seen as a sign of not being one of the elect?
Right. So even in their downtime, people felt this pressure to be productive, to demonstrate their worthiness.
So this fear of idleness, of just being still, is deeply ingrained in our culture.
It is. And it makes genuine rest incredibly difficult.
Because we feel guilty if we're not constantly doing something.
Exactly. John Gray, the philosopher, has even said that genuine idleness has become almost alien to us.
It's like we've forgotten how to rest.
And our sources suggest that this constant busyness can be a way of avoiding uncomfortable feelings.
Like we keep ourselves busy so we don't have to deal with our anxieties or insecurities.
And Stephanie Brown, a researcher, observed something called speed addiction among Silicon Valley overachievers.
Speed addiction.
Yeah, it's this relentless pace of activity and stimulation that serves as a way to numb out unpleasant emotions.
And she compares it to alcoholism.
Because both are ultimately attempts to control unmanageable feelings.
But of course, trying to outrun your emotions never really work.
It doesn't. And it can create this vicious cycle where the thing you're using to numb out actually ends up creating more suffering.
And the problem is our culture often celebrates this kind of drivenness.
Right. It's seen as a sign of ambition and success, rather than a potentially harmful coping mechanism.
And this brings us to a really important point about change. Like, I think we often approach personal growth with this idea that we can just willpower our way through it.
We think if we just try hard enough, we can overcome any obstacle.
But our sources suggest that there's a different kind of surrender that's necessary for real transformation.
Absolutely. There's this great insight from Alcoholics Anonymous. You can't overcome addiction until you give up the hope of being able to control it through willpower.
You have to hit rock bottom first.
It's not so much about hitting rock bottom as it is about surrendering to your limitations.
Accepting that you can't do it alone.
Exactly. And then you can start focusing on what you can actually control.
So maybe we need to approach our relationship with time in a similar way.
By surrendering to the fact that we can't control every minute of our lives.
And that it's okay to not be productive all the time.
Right. And maybe one way to start cultivating that kind of surrender is to practice patience.
Patience.
Yeah. like really slowing down and paying attention to the present moment. And Jennifer Roberts, an art historian, has this amazing exercise where she encourages people to spend extended periods of time looking at a single work of art.
That sounds challenging.
It can be, especially in our culture of instant gratification. But what she found is that when people really slow down and resist the urge to quickly scan and move on, they start to see things they never noticed before.
So it's about training yourself to look deeper, to pay attention to the details.
And it's not just about art. This kind of patient observation can be applied to so many areas of life. Like M. Scott Peck, the psychiatrist, tells this great story about how he overcame his mechanical idiocy by patiently observing his neighbor fix a lawnmower.
He learned how to fix a lawnmower just by watching someone else do it.
Exactly. And he realized that this kind of patient attention is a skill that can be cultivated and applied to all sorts of things.
So it's not just about being patient with ourselves, but also with the world around us.
Right. And it challenges this cultural obsession with novelty and unconventionality. Like, maybe we don't always need to be chasing the next big thing.
Maybe there's just as much value in exploring the familiar, in taking the time to appreciate what's already right in front of us.
And this brings us to a really important point about time, which is that it's not just an individual experience.
That's also a social experience.
Yeah, exactly. Our experience of time is deeply shaped by the rhythms and schedules of the people around us.
So it's like time is a network good.
Yeah, just like a telephone or a social media platform. The value of our time is tied to how many other people share access to it.
So if you have a lot of free time but no one to share it with, it's not really that valuable.
And there are some really interesting historical examples of this. Like, think about the practice of ostracism in ancient Greece.
Where someone was banished from society.
Right, and that was considered one of the worst punishments imaginable because it cut people off from their social networks.
It's like being stranded on a desert island.
And in the Soviet Union, they tried to restructure the work week to create more free time for people.
And how did that go?
It was a total disaster. It ended up disrupting social life and making people really unhappy.
Because it threw off everyone's schedules and made it hard to coordinate their time with others.
Exactly. And this highlights our deep human need for synchronicity, for shared rhythms and rituals.
Like gathering around a campfire or singing in a choir.
Exactly. Those kinds of shared experiences create a sense of connection and belonging.
So maybe the question isn't just how do we manage our individual time, but how do we create a more communal experience of time?
And that's where I think a lot of the productivity advice falls short.
Because it's so focused on individual optimization and boundary setting.
But what if we focus more on creating opportunities for shared experiences?
Like making time for family dinners or joining a community garden or just hanging out with friends without any agenda.
And maybe being willing to be a little more flexible with our schedules so we can be more present with the people around us.
Because ultimately, our relationships are what give our lives meaning.
And it reminds me of the writer of Ecclesiastes, who talks about the vanity of endless toil.
The feeling that it's all meaningless.
It's not necessarily about meaninglessness, but rather about recognizing that our worth isn't tied to our productivity.
That there's more to life than just working and achieving.
And I think that's something that a lot of people started to realize during the pandemic.
Yeah, when everything shut down and we were forced to slow down and reevaluate our priorities.
It was like this collective moment of possibility shock, where we glimpsed a different way of life.
A life with less busyness and more connection.
And ultimately, I think it brings us to a very liberating realization. In the grand scheme of things, what we do with our time probably doesn't matter as much as we think it does.
So maybe we can all just relax a little bit.
Maybe. But it's not about being apathetic or giving up on our goals. It's about shifting our perspective.
From a place of fear and scarcity to a place of acceptance and abundance.
And remembering that true peace of mind comes from embracing our limitations, not from trying to outrun them.
It's like that quote from Charlotte Joko Beck, "Suffering is unbearable only as long as we believe there's a cure."
And this really helpful question that therapist James Hollis suggests we ask ourselves when making decisions. He says, does this choice diminish me or enlarge me?
So it's about aligning our choices with our values, with what truly matters to us.
And I think it's also important to remember that feeling of never quite knowing what we're doing.
Oh yeah, that feeling of being a total imposter.
That's actually a very common human experience.
You mean it's not just me?
It's not just you. And the more we can embrace that uncertainty, the more we can free ourselves to act boldly in the present moment.
Instead of waiting for some future moment when we'll finally feel like we have all the answers.
Exactly. And there's this great principle from Alcoholics Anonymous called doing the next right thing.
Which means?
It means focusing on the immediate step in front of you, even when the ultimate right path is unclear.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture, just focus on the next small step.
And there are even some thinkers like John Zerzan and Derek Jensen who argue that hope itself can be a form of procrastination.
Wait, hope is a bad thing.
It's not that hope is bad, but that a certain kind of passive hope can prevent us from taking action in the present moment.
So it's like we're waiting for someone else to fix things instead of doing it ourselves.
And they suggest that letting go of that kind of hope can actually be empowering.
Because it frees us to focus on what we can actually do right here, right now.
Exactly. Pema Chodron talks about getting the hang of hopelessness, which isn't about giving up, but rather about recognizing that things are already imperfect.
So it's about accepting reality as it is and then working from there.
And in our relationships, it can be really helpful to adopt an attitude of curiosity.
Curiosity about what?
About the other person's perspective, their motivations, their experiences.
So instead of trying to change them, we should just try to understand them.
And maybe even learn something from them.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when we just feel completely overwhelmed and don't know what to do?
Well, meditation teacher Shinzen Young talks about the importance of doing nothing.
Doing nothing.
Yeah. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually a really powerful practice. It's about resisting the urge to constantly manipulate and control our experience.
So like just sitting still and doing absolutely nothing.
Exactly. And it can be surprisingly difficult.
Yeah.
But when we allow ourselves those moments of stillness, we can calm our nervous systems, gain greater clarity, and make more conscious choices about how we spend our time.
So it's about creating space for ourselves to just be.
And maybe in that space, we can start to see things more clearly and make choices that are more aligned with our values and our deepest desires.
Well, I think that's a great place to end our deep dive. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, remember, you have roughly 4,000 weeks. Choose wisely.
But also, don't be afraid to waste a little time every now and then.
Because sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones that don't have a purpose.
So go out there and enjoy your 4,000 weeks.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.